June 23, 1944. 6,500 feet above the Adriatic, sun glinting off aluminum like a million tiny bayonets. You are shoulder-deep in the cramped cockpit of a P-51 Mustang, the air smelling of hot castor oil and cold metal. The wind is a roar in your ears, but beneath it a different sound, steady, dependable, comes from the Rolls-Royce Merlin bolting the nose, full throttle, high climb. Lieutenant James Jimmy Carter is on your left in 302nd Fighter Squadron Red Tail number 42. His visor is smeared with oil, jaw set under a whisper of stubble. Ahead, a long silver column of B-17s and B-24s crawls westward like a mechanical pilgrimage. Box formations, dark noses and ghostly bellies, the gunners' turrets glittering. They smell of grease, sweat, and cordite. They smell like home and like a job that must be done. At the very front of this small coalition, in a brown leather seat with a little more authority than the others, sits Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., rigid, watchful, the lines in his face mapped by too many briefings and too many nights with maps spread across his lap. His gloved hand taps the aluminum on the instrument panel, the sound a metronome, steady, precise. Around him, the 332nd Fighter Group's Mustangs paint short, confident strokes across the sky, their rudders slapped with that unmistakable vermilion that enemy gunners and Allied critics would later call the red tail. Today, the red is shorthand for skill. Below you, Italy is a quilt of olive and dust. Villages like buttons on a cardigan. Churches casting pinprick shadows. On the horizon, the silhouette of enemy aerodromes and flak strips promises the day's teeth. Over the radio, crackling and occasionally lost to static, comes the voice of the lead bomber. Maintain box, elevator set, flak expected on approach. The voice is flat, businesslike. There is no room for sentiment. 2 weeks earlier, the 302nd had taken flak and snatched victory from the jaws of disaster by a hair. Today's mission, a deep penetration to hit rail depots and supply dumps behind the Gustav Line, was a long haul, rich with icing on the cake for both pride and peril. If the B-17s are the slow lumbering horses of this war, the Mustangs are the hounds that flank and drive them. Every pilot here knows the drill. Stay close. Keep the bombers between the fighters and the sky. Wedge yourself into any wedge of Luftwaffe attack before it can reach the vulnerable belly of a fortress or liberator. But there is another sound above the engines. The low, poisonous murmur of rumor and propaganda that has followed these men since they first strapped into trainers at Tuskegee Field. On base and in print, whispers were stitched to caricature, cartoons printed in German sheets, laugh lines drawn across the faces of men who had never seen a black pilot at 10,000 feet. Negro pilots will break down, abandon formations, be a liability. The headlines sneered where they bothered to notice. The laughter was not merely an enemy's lie. It was a domestic poison that seeped into briefings and boot rooms, the skeptic's shorthand for anything that deviated from the white, expected image of American air power. Jimmy flicks a glance at you, a sideways look that reads like a challenge and a reassurance rolled into one. He keeps his eyes on the bomber box. Stick tight, he says, as if giving orders to a brother. Around you, other pilots, Lieutenant Charles Chuck Moore, Sergeant Wallace Harris, check their mirrors, scan their sixes, fingers tight on the triggers. Their instruments are precise, their training hard, their instincts honed on fields and ranges at Tuskegee where instructors like Robert Selway had hammered discipline into the cadets until it was as natural as breath. There is no room for shame in these cockpits. Only execution. A speck appears far ahead, then another, black against the silver. Messerschmitts, fast and clean, appear as if carved from shadow. Your heart doesn't pound so much as accept the data. Angle, closure, altitude. The Mustang's canopy frames the scene like a theater proscenium. Below the curtain of sky, the bombers form an altar of vulnerability. You check fuel, flick the prop control, and roll to intercept with a pilot's economy of motion. There is no grand speech. Combat is a ledger of small certainties. Throttle, sight, lead, fire. The enemy's first pass is a dark comet slicing through sunlight. Tracers lace the air. A B-17 erupts in flame to your starboard. A thin column of black smoke uncoils toward the ground. For one terrible second it feels like the old stories might be true, that a single volley could undo everything. Then the 302nd reacts. Formation discipline snaps like steel. Pilots peel, wedge, and climb. They throw themselves into the paths of attackers so that the heavy bombers can carry on. You watch, hand between the stick and the canopy, as Jimmy positions himself between a messer and the nearest fortress, a slender wall of red-tail steel and American will. The Mustang yawed, its guns spitting. The enemy breaks away, and for a heartbeat, the sky is an orchestra of controlled chaos. No one in your cockpit thinks in headlines. In the next breath, there is only the thunder of rounds and the calculus of keeping those big, lumbering bombers alive. You inhale, taste the bitter tang of adrenaline, and the memory of every insult you'd had to swallow like dust at the enlisted barracks fades into a single, simple fact. A bomber lives because you did what you were trained to do. Up here, above the Adriatic, in the wash of sun and smoke, the 332nd is not an answer to anybody's propaganda. It is a machine of precision and courage. But somewhere below, the presses and radios will have their say. For now, you keep your eyes ahead and your finger gently on the trigger, because the sky demands a currency that truth and rumor will one day have to buy back in full. Long before the Adriatic skies and the gleam of P-51 Mustangs, there was only dust, Alabama dust that clung to boots, coveralls, and the edges of dreams that were supposed to stay grounded. Tuskegee Army Airfield, 1941. A pocket of red earth and heat shimmer, surrounded by cotton fields and the smell of pine tar. Wooden barracks creaked under humidity. Out on the flight line, rows of yellow-winged trainers, PT-17, steermans waited for students whose very presence was an act of defiance. They called it the Tuskegee experiment, though the men training there knew they weren't an experiment. They were proof. Proof that courage and skill had no color. But the phrase carried the sharp edge of condescension. A test to see if Negro pilots could handle complex machinery, if they had the discipline to fly under stress. Cadet Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. stood ramrod straight even in the heat. Son of an Army general, raised under the weight of scrutiny, he'd learned to make silence his armor. Instructors, white officers, some skeptical, some outright hostile, measured every move he made. Cadet Davis never smiles, one remarked. He didn't need to. He was building something much heavier than a grin could hold. Down the line, a young man named Charles McGee was studying the way sunlight struck the propeller of his steerman. He would later call it a kind of faith, the belief that flight was both liberation and burden. They told us we'd fail, he said years later, so we decided not to. Their early missions weren't in the sky, they were on the ground, battling prejudice baked into policy. Mechanics were told black hands couldn't maintain aircraft. Navigators were reassigned to kitchens. The men who passed flight checkouts returned to find their postings, delayed for administrative reasons. Every small victory was a fight to stay in the program. When the 99th Fighter Squadron finally shipped out in 1943, headed for North Africa under the command of Major Davis, the newspapers back home barely noticed. What little they did say dripped with skepticism. One headline read, Negro Squadron to try combat role. The try did the damage, but the 99th did more than try. Over Pantelleria, Sicily, and Anzio, Italy, they fought in battered P-40 Warhawks. Outdated, underpowered, yet flown with surgical precision. They strafed enemy supply lines, destroyed fuel dumps, and protected Allied ground troops under heavy fire. Still, no matter their success, the skepticism persisted. Reports from higher command questioned their aggressiveness, ignoring the reality that the unit had been ordered to fly defensive, missions that didn't allow for flashy kills. Major Davis took that insult personally. He flew to Washington to face the War Department himself. His tone clipped and his evidence undeniable. Our record speaks for itself. He demanded the chance for his men to prove their worth where it counted, in the bomber escort missions over Europe. By early 1944, the 382nd Fighter Group was born from that defiance, uniting the 99th with new squadrons trained at Tuskegee. The 100th, 301st, and 302nd, Davis, now a lieutenant colonel, took command. The group was sent to Ramitelli Airfield on Italy's Adriatic coast, a strip of steel matting and red mud, surrounded by olive groves and the constant throb of engines, warming up. It was there that they received their new aircraft, the sleek, long-legged North American P-51 Mustang. Polished aluminum, long nose, bubble canopy. The pilots had never flown anything like it. It was fast enough to chase down a Messerschmitt, strong enough to dive through flak, and most importantly, had the range to follow bombers deep into enemy territory. On the day the first Mustangs arrived, ground crews gathered around them like acolytes at an altar. Someone suggested painting the tails red, not just for identification but as a mark of pride. The idea stuck. From that moment, the 382nd became known simply as the Red Tails. Soon the Luftwaffe would learn that those crimson tails meant trouble. And back in Berlin, a different kind of warfare was already underway. Propaganda broadcasts, transmitted in polished English from German radio stations, mocked the idea of colored pilots. One announcer sneered that the Americans had resorted to using Africans in airplanes, surely a sign the war is lost. The tone was theatrical, dripping with contempt. But within months, those same German broadcasters would whisper the name Schwarze Vogelmenschen, the Black Birdmen, with a hint of awe. For the Red Tails were rewriting the rules of air combat one mission at a time, and every bomber they brought home safely was another nail in the coffin of racist myth. The world above Italy was about to learn a lesson in precision, patience, and quiet vengeance. March 24, 1945, 36,000 feet above the Danube Valley. Frost on the canopies. Vapor trails carving white scars across a blue so sharp it looks like it could cut your lungs open. The mission call sign, Frantic 7th, a maximum effort raid on Berlin's oil refineries and rail depots. The bombers are in tight formation, massive silver flocks of B-17s from the 15th Air Force. To their left, smaller, faster shadows, Mustangs of the 332nd Fighter Group, slide into position. Lieutenant Charles McGee checks his 6, the hum of the Merlin engine steady beneath his boots. His P-51 kitten wears its red tail like a badge of defiance. Ahead, Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. leads the formation with his usual precision, issuing clipped commands through the radio. Red leader to all squadrons, tighten up. Keep those fortresses covered. We're not letting anyone through today. Below, the Austrian countryside rushes past, a patchwork of snow and river. The air is bitter thin. Oxygen masks hiss rhythmically like a second heartbeat, and then movement. Specks black and sharp-edged sliding down out of the sun. Bandits 2 o'clock high. Fucky Wolves 20 plus. The call snaps through the formation. Instantly, Mustangs peel off in pairs, banking hard into the glare. The 301st Squadron takes the high flank. The 302nd dives beneath the bomber stream. The sky erupts. Tracers streak orange against the blue. Flak bursts like black flowers in the cold. A B-17 takes a direct hit to its wing. Fire blossoms, trailing smoke. The bomber lurches, but before it can spiral down, a red-tailed Mustang slides beneath it. Jimmy Carter's P-51. He radios, "Easy, Fortress 3-1. Hold your line. We've got your tail covered." A Messerschmitt Me-109 dives in, guns blazing. Carter jerks the stick, cutting across the bomber's wake, squeezing his trigger. 50 caliber rounds rip into the German's fuselage. The Me-109 explodes into a rolling fireball. The Fortress holds course, engines coughing but alive. In the chaos, another German pilot swings around, angling for the belly of the formation. Davis himself breaks formation, ignoring his own safety. He pulls hard into a climb, rolls and drops directly behind the attacker. The German never sees it coming. Davis's Mustang opens fire, short, controlled bursts. The Me-109 disintegrates, a flash of silver and black. The radio crackles. Scratch one bandit.
"Stay with the bombers!"
That last line becomes a mantra. Stay with the bombers. It's not a slogan, it's a code drilled into the Red Tails since Tuskegee. Other fighter groups sometimes chased kills, diving after fleeing enemies and leaving the bombers exposed. But Davis had made one rule clear. No bomber gets left unguarded. To the men flying in the lumbering fortresses below, the sight of those red tails above them was more than comfort. It was survival. Pilots later said they'd relax, if only for a moment, when they saw those crimson rudders flash in the sun. That day over Austria, the Luftwaffe learned what that meant. 25 German fighters were destroyed. The 332nd lost only 3 Mustangs, and not a single bomber went down. In the debriefing tent back at Ramitelli, pilots sat in silence, steam rising from their flight suits. Grease smudged their faces. Their hands still shook from the adrenaline. McGee looked across at Carter and grinned through cracked lips. "Still think we can't fight?" Carter laughed, but the humor didn't hide the exhaustion. "We'll fight anyone who says otherwise," he replied. News of the mission filtered slowly through command channels. First as whispers, then as astonishment. Crews from other bomber groups began requesting the Red Tail Angels by name. In briefing rooms across Italy, maps of future missions were marked with the letters 332nd, a quiet acknowledgement of trust that no memo could erase. But not everyone celebrated. Some officers still clung to prejudice like a lifeline. Reports were written with faint praise. Negro squadron performed adequately. Others minimized their achievements as luck. The pilots ignored it. They knew what they'd done above Austria wasn't luck. It was discipline forged from humiliation, precision born from exclusion. And as for the Germans? Propaganda broadcasts stopped laughing. Instead, they warned bomber crews to beware the Schwarze Teufel mit roten Schwänzen, the black devils with red tails. The men of the 332nd didn't need to hear it. They'd already written their answer in contrails and wreckage over Europe. But the war wasn't over yet. Ahead lay the most dangerous missions of all, Berlin itself, where the air was thick with flak and the truth of their legend would finally be sealed. April 15th, 1945. Dawn, over Ramitelli Airfield. The Adriatic glows like molten glass beneath the rising sun. Engines roar one by one across the steel-matted runway, the vibration shuddering through the bones of the earth. Crews move with practiced rhythm. Ground men checking wing tanks, armorers loading belts of .50 caliber rounds into the P-51s, the links rattling like chainmail. This is the one they've been waiting for. The biggest run of all, a full-force escort to Berlin, the heart of the Reich, the capital of everything they'd been told they couldn't defeat, and the stage where they'd carve their legend. Lieutenant? Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. walks the flight line in silence, helmet tucked under his arm. His red-trimmed Mustang gleams in the morning light. The other pilots, McGee, Carter, Porter, Hall, watch him as he stops, turns, and looks at them the way a conductor looks at his orchestra before the overture. "We've come a long way from Tuskegee, gentlemen," Davis says. "They said we wouldn't make it this far. Let's show them why they were wrong." No one cheers. They just nod, the kind of nod that comes from men who've seen too much to need applause. At 0700 hours, the 332nd Fighter Group lifts into the sky. The formation stretches for miles, rows of P-51 Mustangs climbing eastward, their red tails flashing like streaks of fire. Above them, the B-17s form up, flying fortresses of the 483rd Bomb Group, loaded with ordnance destined for the rail yards and oil depots on Berlin's outskirts. The air over the Alps is calm at first. The sun turns the canopies gold. But as they near Germany, the sky darkens with flak, thick black bursts that hammer the air and leave the scent of burning metal in their wake. "Flak heavy at 12 o'clock, calls McGee over the radio. "Stay tight. Watch your altitude." They weave through the bursts, the bomber stream tightening its formation. Through the haze, the first enemy fighters appear. Me-262 jet interceptors, sleek and impossibly fast, slicing through the air like thrown knives. The radio explodes with chatter.
Jets coming in high, 10 o'clock.
The red tails move instantly, diving into the attack. It's chaos, a blur of contrails, tracers, and explosions. A Me-262 streaks past McGee. The jets roar, shaking his canopy. He rolls hard, lines up, and fires, leading the target by instinct. His rounds connect. Sparks and smoke burst from the German's engine. The jet spirals down, vanishing into cloud. Meanwhile, Davis spots a cluster of Focke-Wulfs moving to flank the bombers. He signals to Carter and Hall. "Red leader to Red 3. Take the right wing. Keep them off the forts." They dive as one. The Mustangs carve arcs through the sky, their guns flashing. The air becomes a storm of lead. Below them, the bombers drop their payloads, hundreds of bombs tumbling toward Berlin's war machine. From above, it looks like the earth itself is on fire. Inside one of the B-17s, a waist gunner named Private Bill Stokes glances out the small side window. He can barely hear his own thoughts over the engines. But there, above the bomber's wing, he catches sight of a Mustang, its rudder painted deep red. The pilot waggles his wings in salute before banking off to chase an approaching German fighter. Later, Stokes would say, "When we saw those red tails, we knew we'd make it home. For hours the battle rages. The Luftwaffe throws everything it has left into the defense, jets, prop fighters, anti-aircraft batteries. But the 332nd holds firm. No bomber is lost. Not one. By the time the formation turns for home, The radio traffic has thinned to exhaustion and disbelief. McGee looks out across the horizon. Dozens of bombers still flying in formation, their silver skins untouched by fire. He can hardly believe it. Neither can the men back at command. At Ramitelli, as the Mustangs roll to a stop, ground crews cheer despite Davis's strict discipline. Fuel-streaked mechanics slap the fuselages, shouting, "Not one lost." Not one. Davis climbs down from his Mustang, removes his helmet, and looks toward the Adriatic. He says nothing for a long time. When he finally speaks, it's quiet enough that only those nearest can hear. That's what they'll remember us for. And he's right. Word spreads through the 15th Air Force in hours, then across the Atlantic in days. Newspapers that once questioned the Negro Airmen now print new headlines. Red tail angels keep perfect record. Not one bomber lost. In Berlin, German propagandists who once mocked them as a novelty go silent. The name Tuskegee becomes a symbol of something the Reich can't explain or erase, a unity that even hate couldn't divide. But for the men of the 382nd, the victory is bittersweet. They've fought two wars, one against the Luftwaffe and one against the very country they serve. As night falls on Ramitelli, McGee sits on an empty ammo crate, listening to the engines wind down. "Do you think they'll ever see us as just pilots?" he asks softly. Davis, passing by, answers without stopping. "No, they'll see us as the ones who never lost a bomber." By late April 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing under its own weight. Allied tanks were crossing the Rhine, and Soviet artillery could already hear the echoes of Berlin. Yet even as cities burned, another war was being waged, one made of words, airwaves, and lies. In Germany, Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda had long mocked the idea of black aviators in the U.S. Army Air Forces. For years, Nazi radio broadcasts beamed English-language messages toward Allied lines, dripping with racial poison. "American Negro soldiers fight for a nation that despises them," sneered the voice of Axis Sally, smooth and cutting. "Your white officers use you, but they'll never let you share their victory." She was wrong, but not entirely. The irony was cruel. The same nation that demanded the Tuskegee Airmen risk their lives in the sky still segregated them on the ground. At Ramitelli, the men of the 302nd Fighter Group knew this all too well. Their mess halls were separated. They weren't allowed to visit the same clubs as white officers stationed nearby. Even the military police who patrolled the airfield sometimes treated them as intruders on their own base. But up in the air, 25,000 feet over Europe, the truth had no room for segregation. Up there, only skill mattered, only discipline. The Luftwaffe had stopped laughing. German intelligence reports from early 1945 reveal a shift in tone. Where once they called the 302nd inferior pilots, they now described them as highly organized and difficult to engage. One intercepted field report warned, "Red-tailed Mustangs escorting bomber formations are especially dangerous. Avoid head-on engagements, they fly with remarkable cohesion." The Nazis' racial ideology could not compute what their radar screen showed them: that the so-called Negro squadrons were among the most feared and efficient fighter escorts in the entire Allied Air Force. Still, propaganda is stubborn. In Berlin, Goebbels' papers continued to issue cartoonish depictions of African-American soldiers, clumsy, lazy, incompetent. But the men who fought them in the sky were sending back a different message, one written in smoke: wreckage and empty enemy runways. Meanwhile, back in the United States, a subtler propaganda machine had been running for years. Newspapers rarely printed the Tuskegee Airmen's successes. When they did, the language was cautious, condescending. Negro flyers perform admirably under supervision. It was easier for a nation built on segregation to ignore the contradiction that these men embodied. Black pilots fighting for a freedom they didn't yet fully share. One evening, after the Berlin run, Lieutenant Charles McGee sat in the tent that served as their mess hall, flipping through a Stars and Stripes newspaper. On the front page was a photo of white bomber crews, grinning under a headline that read, "Successful Raid on Berlin." No mention of the 302nd Fighter Group. McGee folded the paper and set it aside. Around him, other pilots played cards, cleaned pistols, or wrote letters home. The sound of laughter drifted through the air. the laughter of men who no longer needed headlines to validate them. "Doesn't bother you?" asked Jimmy Carter, glancing up from his notebook. McGee shook his head slowly. "They don't have to print it," he said. "We lived it." Outside, the engines of grounded Mustangs cooled in the dark. Mechanics leaned against them, trading stories. A few of the younger men traced the red paint on the tails with their fingers, as if to remind themselves it was real. Word of their achievements would spread anyway, not through newspapers or broadcasts, but through the mouths of bomber crews. Pilots who'd returned home alive because of the red tails told their families, their commanders, and their comrades. By war's end, the 332nd had flown more than 1,500 missions. They destroyed over 200 enemy aircraft in the air, hundreds more on the ground, and achieved something no other escort group could claim. They had never lost a single bomber under their direct protection. The propaganda, both foreign and domestic, had failed. The truth was flying home in the logbooks, gun camera footage, and testimonies of the men who'd seen those crimson tails appear in their hour of need. Back in Berlin, the broadcasts that once ridiculed the Negro airmen had gone silent. The Reich was burning, Goebbels was dead, but at Ramitelli the airmen were already thinking ahead, not to the next mission, but to what would happen when they returned to a country that might still refuse to salute them. For the first time, they began to wonder, what if the real battle was just beginning? May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day at Ramitelli Airfield. The sound of engines is replaced by the sound of celebration, bottles clinking, laughter echoing through hangars that once smelled only of oil and sweat. The Red Tails, the men of the 332nd Fighter Group, stand in small knots around the field, the sunset glinting off their worn flight goggles and the wings pinned to their uniforms. For a moment, the war feels like it's truly over. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. steps out of the operations tent, clipboard in hand, as he always does. Even in victory, his posture is crisp, unyielding. A young airman, half drunk on the rare luxury of peace, calls out, "Sir, they say Berlin's ours." The Germans surrendered. Davis pauses, looks toward the sky, the same sky that had been his battlefield for 3 long years, and simply says, "Good. Now comes the hard part." He knows what's waiting on the other side of the Atlantic. When the Tuskegee Airmen return home, there are no parades for them, no brass bands waiting at the docks. The country they fought for still sees them as outsiders in uniform. At train stations in the South, some are forced to sit in colored cars again before they even make it home. The war might have ended in Europe, but the fight for respect, dignity, and recognition was only beginning. At Freeman Field in Indiana, Black officers from the 477th Bombardment Group, many of them veterans of the 332nd, stage a quiet act of rebellion. Barred from entering the White Officers Club, they walk in anyway, dressed in full uniform. One by one, they are arrested. The event becomes known as the Freeman Field Mutiny, a spark of defiance that would echo through the coming civil rights movement. Davis, now promoted to full colonel, testifies in their defense. His composure never cracks. "We have shown we can fly and fight," he tells his superiors. "But it's time America learns that we can also lead." Meanwhile, stories of the Red Tails spread through word of mouth, through bomber crews who owe their lives to them, through families who remember their letters home, through photographs smuggled in duffel bags and tucked into Bibles. One photograph, taken near the end of the war, shows a row of Mustangs gleaming in the sun, their tails bright red against the pale Italian dust, written in pencil on the back, "They mocked us once. Now they call us angels." The legend grows. Charles McGee stays in the Air Force, flying combat missions in Korea and Vietnam. He'll log more than 400 combat sorties in 3 different wars, one of the longest active service careers in American history. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. will rise higher still, becoming the first black general in the United States Air Force. But even decades later, when the sky is quiet and the world seems to have forgotten, the memory of Ramitelli remains etched in the minds of those who were there. A bomber pilot from the 483rd writes in his memoir, "We'd watched the horizon for those red tails. When we saw them, we knew we'd make it back. They never lost one of us, not one. I didn't care what color they were. They were the best. And that was the quiet revenge, the most powerful rebuttal to every cartoon, every sneer, every piece of propaganda ever printed. Because the Tuskegee Airmen didn't just fight a war. They rewrote the meaning of American heroism. They took the sky that had been denied to them and made it their own, painting their defiance in red across the heavens. Years later, when President Truman signs Executive Order 9981, officially desegregating the U.S. military in 1948, the document carries an invisible fingerprint, the legacy of the men who proved that courage has no color. In museums now, their Mustangs sit behind ropes, their paint gleaming under soft light. Schoolchildren stare up at those red tails and read plaques that tell only part of the story. What the plaques can't capture is the smell of burnt oil at 25,000 feet, the taste of fear and pride mixed in the same breath, or the sound of a calm voice over the radio saying, "Stay with the bombers. History tends to polish its heroes." But the truth of the Tuskegee Airmen is raw, unpolished, and earned. They were mocked by enemies and doubted by allies. But in the end, they became something far greater than either side could imagine. Symbols of discipline, defiance, and undeniable excellence. So when you look at those crimson tails, remember this: they were more than color. They were proof. Proof that a lie repeated for generations could be shot down in the span of a single war, and they never lost a bomber.